Princess Lyra was born into a world of power and privilege, the heir to a majestic alien kingdom that spanned galaxies. She was small, though, tiny compared to the towering warriors of her people. The males of her race, tall and strong, were proud of their physical might. And to them, that was the true measure of a person's worth. Being small, delicate even, made Lyra feel out of place. Her royal blood gave her respect, but it didn't make her feel strong or powerful. She had longed for someone who would see beyond her size, someone who would appreciate her for the unique person she was. But that person never seemed to come. From a young age, she was told stories of the great warriors and rulers her ancestors had been. Stories of great battles, endless conquests, and powerful alliances. Her father, the king, was one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. But no one ever told her that strength could be found in something other than muscle and power. She had watched many suitors come and go, each one more intimidating than the last, hoping to win her heart. But they never saw her. They only saw a tiny princess, too weak to stand beside them in battle, too fragile to rule beside them. They rejected her. Her first rejection had come when she was just a young adult. A handsome warrior named Torek, tall and proud, had been chosen as her first suitor. He was everything her people admired. Powerful, fierce, and strong. He was also a skilled fighter, known throughout the galaxy for his ability to crush enemies with his bare hands. Lyra had hoped that Torek would be different, that he might see past her size, past her delicate features, and see the strength she carried within. But when they spoke, he barely looked her way. His eyes were always focused on the other warriors around them, never on her. He didn't even bother to hide his disinterest. Torek had made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that he was looking for a mate who could stand beside him in battle, someone who could defend their kingdom with force and might. And Lyra, with her small frame, was not that person. With each rejection, Lyra's heart broke just a little more. She could no longer count the number of suitors who had turned their backs on her. Her father's advisors pushed for her to marry one of the strongest warriors in the kingdom. They believed it was the only way to secure her position, to strengthen the kingdom's hold over its enemies. But Lyra didn't want power, not in the way they imagined it. She wanted to be loved, to be seen, to be valued for more than just her status. But in a world where strength was everything, she had nothing to offer. When the day came that Lyra had to choose her next suitor, she felt both nervous and defeated. She stood in the royal hall, surrounded by some of the strongest, most respected men in her kingdom. They towered over her, each one exuding power and dominance. Their faces were stern and serious, as if expecting Lyra to be honored just by their presence. But in her heart, she felt no excitement. She felt nothing but a deep sense of loneliness. The men spoke to her, trying to impress her with tales of their strength, their bravery, and their skills. Each one boasted of their accomplishments in battle, of how they had conquered planets and fought off entire armies. They talked of wars they had won, and how they could offer Lyra the strength she needed to rule her kingdom. But Lyra could not help but feel that none of them truly saw her. They saw her as a title, a prize to be won, but none of them saw the person behind the crown. As the suitors took turns speaking to her, Lyra found herself drifting into her own thoughts. She imagined a life without these pressures, a life where she could be with someone who cared for her as she was, someone who would not judge her for being small, for being different. She wished for someone who would see beyond the surface, beyond the power and the strength, and truly understand who she was. But that person did not seem to exist. Lyra had become so used to rejection that she almost expected it. Her dreams of finding someone who would love her for herself were fading, slipping through her fingers like sand. She began to wonder if perhaps she was destined to rule alone, never to have the companionship she longed for. Her father, King Uldar, noticed the sadness in her eyes. He had watched his daughter struggle, seen the pain she hid behind her royal duties. He knew the pressure she was under, but he also knew the importance of strength in their world. He had always told her that being a ruler meant making tough choices, and that sometimes those choices meant sacrificing personal happiness for the good of the kingdom. Lyra had never fully understood that until now. She had always believed that there was more to life than power, more to a ruler than just their title. But as the days passed, she began to wonder if maybe she was wrong. As the last suitor spoke, Lyra realized something. She didn't want to be just another princess, another symbol of power. She wanted to be loved. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that no one, not even the men in her kingdom, would ever be able to love her for who she truly was. She was too small, too weak, too different, and no amount of strength would ever change that. Lyra's heart sank, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of her loneliness. The next few days felt like a blur to Princess Lyra. The rejection, the disappointment, and the constant pressure from her advisors weighed heavily on her shoulders. It seemed like the world was closing in around her. Every time she walked through the royal halls, she was met with whispers behind her back, eyes that judged her for not living up to expectations. Her heart felt heavy with the thought that she would never find the connection she so desperately longed for. But on one quiet morning, everything changed. Lyra had been summoned to a meeting with her father, King Aldar, and his closest advisors. She entered the room, expecting the usual talk about marriage and alliances. But this time, the mood was different. The king's face was serious, his eyes focused on a small group of visitors standing at the far end of the room. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she saw the group, a mix of alien diplomats and soldiers, but what caught her attention was one man standing among them. He was different. While the other aliens were tall, muscular, and imposing, this man was smaller than most, almost fragile compared to the others. His dark hair was cropped short, and his features were human, which meant he was from another world entirely. But it wasn't just his appearance that caught Lyra's attention. It was the way he stood. He was calm, confident, and yet there was something about him that didn't scream for attention like the others. He didn't have the air of arrogance that so many of her people seemed to have. He just stood there. King Aldar noticed his daughter's gaze and motioned for her to come forward. "Lyra," he said, his voice firm but warm, "this is Captain Ethan Matthews. He is one of the human soldiers assigned to assist in our upcoming peace talks with the Varkians." Lyra glanced at Ethan once more. He had deep brown eyes that seemed to hold a quiet understanding, like he had seen much of the galaxy and wasn't easily impressed by power or wealth. His calm presence stood in stark contrast to the brash and loud warriors that usually surrounded her. He smiled politely as Lyra approached, but it wasn't a smile filled with expectation. It was simple and kind, as if he wasn't trying to win anything. Ethan extended his hand, his voice gentle. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Your Highness." Lyra hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. His touch was firm but warm, a small, simple gesture that left a deeper impression than any of the grand gestures from her other suitors. She found herself looking into his eyes for a moment longer than necessary, feeling something inside her stir, something she couldn't quite place. The meeting continued with discussions of politics, peace, and military strategies, but Lyra couldn't help but notice that Ethan seemed uninterested in the usual displays of power. While the others in the room spoke of strength and dominance, Ethan kept his responses measured, thoughtful, and above all, respectful. He didn't care about impressing anyone. He cared about the matter at hand, about peace, about making the world a better place. As the meeting went on, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was different from everyone she had ever met. He wasn't the type of man who would try to win her over with boasts of battles won or warriors conquered. Instead, he seemed to want to learn more about her, to understand her beyond her title. He asked her questions, not about politics, but about her interests, her kingdom, and what it was like being a princess. It felt strange, but also refreshing, to have someone ask about her as a person, not just as a royal figure. After the meeting ended, Lyra stayed behind for a moment to gather her thoughts. She had 1,000 questions swirling in her mind, and none of them had to do with the upcoming peace talks or the future of her kingdom. They all had to do with Ethan. "What do you think of him?" her father asked as they walked out of the room together. Lyra wasn't sure how to answer. She had always been taught to focus on the needs of the kingdom, to marry for power and alliances, to choose someone who would help secure the future of their people. But Ethan was different. There was no talk of power, no mention of strength. He seemed to care about people, about connections. He had been kind, respectful, and treated her as if she were just a person, not a title. "I don't know," Lyra said, her voice quiet. "But he's not like the others. He doesn't see me the way they do." Her father raised an eyebrow. "And how do they see you?" "Like a prize," Lyra replied bitterly. "Something to be won. But Ethan, he's different. He actually listened to me. He didn't try to impress me." Cain Uldar studied his daughter for a moment. "Your heart will guide you, Lyra. But remember, as a princess, your duty is not just to yourself. It's to the people. Never forget that." Lyra nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The way he had looked at her, not as a fragile princess, but as a person. The way he made her feel seen. Later that evening, Lyra wandered the royal gardens alone. She had come here often as a child, seeking solace in the quiet beauty of the flowers and the gentle rustling of the leaves. Tonight, however, she found no peace. Her thoughts were filled with Ethan. Why did he treat her so differently? What was it about him that made her feel more alive than any of the warriors who had come before him? She didn't know the answers. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something. Something more than duty, more than rejection. A small spark of hope. Perhaps there was someone out there who could see her, truly see her, for who she was. And his name was Ethan. The days after the meeting with Captain Ethan Matthews felt different to Princess Lyra. She couldn't stop thinking about him. His calm presence, his respectful questions, and the way he listened to her. It was all so new. In her world, people rarely took the time to truly listen to her. Most saw her as a symbol, a piece of royalty to be admired from a distance. But Ethan had looked at her like she was just a person who had thoughts, fears, and hopes, not just a crown. As the days passed, Lyra found herself thinking about him more and more. She had never imagined that she could be drawn to a human, let alone a soldier who wasn't even part of her world. Yet there was something in Ethan's eyes that made her feel understood, something that made her wonder if maybe she had been wrong all along. Perhaps strength wasn't about size or power. Maybe true strength came from within, from courage, compassion, and the ability to see others for who they truly were. Still, Lyra couldn't shake the doubts that lingered in her mind. She had been raised to believe that a ruler needed a partner who was strong in battle, someone who could defend their kingdom with might and force. Her advisors often told her that marriage was about securing power, about choosing someone who could help her maintain control over her people. That was the way things were done in her world. But Ethan wasn't like the warrior she had been expected to marry. He wasn't the kind of man who would lead armies or conquer planets. Instead, he had shown her kindness, something that seemed almost foreign to her in a world where strength was everything. One evening, Lyra sat in her private chambers, staring out of the large window that overlooked the kingdom. The city below glowed with lights, and the stars above seemed endless. She should have felt peaceful, but her mind was filled with questions. Could she really go against everything she had been taught? Could she choose Ethan, a human, over the powerful warriors of her own people? Was it even possible for someone like her, someone so small and fragile, to build a life with someone so different? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Lyra turned to see one of her servants, a young woman named Maris, standing in the doorway. "Your Highness," Maris said with a respectful bow, "there's someone here to see you. Captain Ethan, he asked if he could speak with you." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping for a chance to speak with Ethan again, but she hadn't expected him to seek her out. She quickly composed herself and nodded. "Please, let him in." Maris stepped aside, and Ethan entered the room with a smile. He was dressed simply, no military armor or impressive garb, just plain clothes that made him look even more human, more like someone she could talk to without the weight of royalty between them. "Princess Lyra," Ethan said with a nod, his voice warm but not overly formal. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Lyra shook her head, standing to greet him. "No, not at all. I'm glad you came." There was a brief moment of silence, as they both seemed unsure of how to begin. Ethan finally spoke, his voice soft. "I wanted to check on you. After the meeting, I felt like maybe we didn't get a chance to talk properly. I know you're under a lot of pressure right now." Lyra smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. Pressure is an understatement. I don't think anyone understands what it's like to live under a crown, to have every decision scrutinized and every move expected to be perfect. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving her face. "It must be hard. But I think, sometimes, people forget that rulers are human too. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Lyra looked away, feeling vulnerable under his gaze. "That's the problem," she said quietly. "I don't know how to let anyone in. I spent so much of my life trying to live up to everyone else's expectations that I've forgotten what it means to be myself. And now, with everything happening, I don't even know who I am anymore." Ethan stepped closer, his expression kind but firm. "You're more than just a princess, Lyra. You're a person, and you deserve to be happy, not just powerful. I know that may seem hard to believe, but it's true. I think there's more to you than the role you've been given." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before. Ethan wasn't telling her what she wanted to hear. He was telling her what she needed to hear. The truth was, she had always felt trapped in the role she had been born into, expected to live up to a standard that wasn't even hers. She had longed for someone to see beyond the crown, beyond the title, and to simply see her for who she truly was. And for the first time, she felt like Ethan was doing just that. "I don't know if I can change," Lyra admitted, her voice shaky. "I've spent my whole life being told that I have to be strong, that I have to choose a mate who can help me rule. But what if I'm not meant for that? What if I'm just too different?" Ethan smiled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not too different, Lyra. You're unique, and that's what makes you special." For a moment, there was a quiet calm between them. Lyra felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the walls she had built around her heart. She had always believed that strength was about power and control, but now she was starting to see that maybe strength was about vulnerability, about allowing herself to be seen, even if it meant taking a chance. "I don't know what the future holds," Lyra said softly, "but for the first time in my life, I feel like there's a chance for something different. Something real." Ethan's smile grew wider, and he nodded. "That's all any of us can hope for, Lyra. The chance for something real." As the conversation ended and Ethan left, Lyra stood by the window once more, gazing out at the stars. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the crown. The days following her conversation with Ethan were filled with both relief and anxiety. Princess Lyra had never felt so torn in her life. She was beginning to see a new path, one where she could embrace who she truly was, not just the title she had been given. But every time she allowed herself to hope for a different future, the pressure of her responsibilities would pull her back into the reality of her kingdom. Lyra was sitting in the royal hall when her father, King Aldar, entered. His face was serious, and his expression made her stomach tighten. She had always respected her father, but recently, she felt distant from him. His beliefs, rooted in tradition, seemed to clash with the growing sense of self she was discovering. "Lyra," King Aldar began, his voice stern, "we must discuss your future. The time has come for you to choose your suitor." Her heart sank. The conversation was always the same, but now it felt different. She had hoped for more time, time to figure out what she truly wanted. But duty always came first, and she was a princess after all. "I know, Father," Lyra replied, her voice quiet, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for this." King Aldar's eyes softened slightly, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his voice. "You don't have the luxury of time, Lyra. The kingdom needs strength, and the people look to you to make the right choice. The decision is not just about your happiness, but about the future of the kingdom." Lyra swallowed, her heart heavy. "I understand my duties, Father, but I'm not sure I can marry for power. It's not what I want." The king sighed deeply. "Your feelings don't change reality. The future of our kingdom depends on who you choose. We need an alliance, someone who will help strengthen our position in the galaxy. This isn't about personal desire. It's about the survival of our people." Lyra's mind wandered back to Ethan. He wasn't a prince, nor a warrior, nor someone who could strengthen her kingdom in the way her father meant. He didn't fit the mold of the perfect suitor. And yet, every part of her longed to choose him. I've been thinking," Lyra said hesitantly. "There's someone. A human soldier, Ethan Matthews. He's different from anyone I've met. He doesn't want power or glory. He sees me for who I am, not just a princess." Her father's face darkened. "A human? This is absurd, Lyra. A human cannot rule by your side. They are not our kind. We cannot afford to weaken ourselves by making such a choice. Your people will never accept it." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. For the first time, Lyra felt the full force of the expectations that had been placed on her since birth. She wasn't just a person. She was a symbol of power, of legacy. And the thought of rejecting that to follow her heart seemed impossible. "But Father," Lyra protested, "Ethan is kind, wise, and brave. He's proven that in the little time I've known him. He doesn't see me as a prize or a symbol. He sees me as someone real." "Your heart is leading you down a dangerous path, Lyra," King Aldar warned, his voice low and firm. "You cannot afford to be naive. A ruler does not choose a partner based on feelings. A ruler chooses based on what is best for the kingdom." Lyra's throat tightened as she tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Her father's words felt like a betrayal. All her life, she had been taught that duty and strength were the only things that mattered. But in Ethan, she saw something different, something that made her believe there was more to life than just power. "Do you love him then?" her father asked sharply, his voice cutting through the silence. Lyra didn't know how to answer. The word love felt too big, too powerful. She didn't know if she loved Ethan, but she knew that she cared for him deeply. There was something about the way he treated her, the way he made her feel seen, like she wasn't just a crown to be worn, but a person to be understood. That, more than anything, was what she wanted. A connection that went beyond duty. "I don't know yet," Lyra said softly, her voice trembling. "But I want to find out." King Aldar shook his head, disappointment etched across his face. "This is madness, Lyra. You are the future of our kingdom. You must put that above all else. The people expect you to make a strong choice, not a foolish one." Lyra stood in silence, her mind racing. She didn't want to disappoint her father, but she also didn't want to lose herself in the process. She had spent her life trying to meet the expectations of others, and it had made her feel empty inside. For once, she wanted to make a choice that was hers. She wanted to find someone who saw her as more than just a princess, more than just an object of power. Later that day, Lyra walked through the palace gardens, her thoughts swirling. The warm breeze ruffled her hair, but it did little to calm her mind. Her father had made it clear. Her duty came first. Ethan, with all his kindness and respect, couldn't offer her the power her kingdom needed. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the power she was supposed to secure might not be the kind she wanted after all. As the sun began to set, Lyra found herself standing at the edge of the garden, staring into the distance. She could hear the distant sounds of the palace, the whispers of her people, and the voices of her advisors. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could hear her own voice too, one that was slowly beginning to speak louder than the rest. Maybe it was time to listen to that voice, to find the strength to make her own choice, even if it meant going against everything she had been taught, even if it meant risking everything for the chance at something real. Princess Lyra sat in her royal chambers, staring out at the distant horizon. The bright colors of the sunset painted the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink, but inside, her heart was heavy. The conversation with her father earlier that day still echoed in her mind. His words had been sharp, filled with disappointment. He had made it clear that her choice, whether she liked it or not, would impact not only her life, but the future of the entire kingdom. The weight of that responsibility felt more crushing than ever before. She thought about Ethan again, the human soldier. He had been kind, patient, and understanding in a way no one else had ever been. He hadn't tried to impress her with his strength or power, things her people valued most. Instead, he had listened to her. He had respected her, treated her as a person rather than a princess. But now, faced with the reality of her duty, Lyra couldn't help but wonder if that would be enough. Was a relationship built on kindness enough to face the challenges ahead? Suddenly, a soft knock on the door brought her back to the present. "Your Highness, Captain Ethan Matthews is here to see you," a servant announced. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she wasn't sure what to say. Would Ethan still want to be near her after hearing all that her kingdom required of her? Would he understand the weight of her decision? "Let him in," she said softly, trying to steady her nerves. Ethan stepped into the room, looking as calm and collected as ever. He was dressed in his usual simple attire, a sharp contrast to the royal finery that surrounded Lyra. He didn't look like someone who could change the course of an entire kingdom, but there was something about him that made her feel he could. "Princess," he greeted her with a small smile, his voice warm and genuine. "Ethan," she replied, offering a weak smile in return. "I'm glad you came." He stepped closer, his eyes studying her face with a quiet understanding. "I could feel the tension when I saw you earlier in the palace," he said, his tone soft. "You've been carrying a heavy burden." Lyra sighed, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "I don't know how much longer I can keep up this act. My father wants me to choose a suitor who will secure the kingdom's power, but I don't think that's what I want anymore. I'm not sure I can live with that choice." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I can't pretend to understand all the politics, but I know this. You don't have to choose based on what others think. You deserve more than that." Lyra felt her heart flutter. He was right, of course, but the fear of letting down her people, of disappointing her father, was still there. It was hard to ignore. She looked away, feeling overwhelmed. "I've always been told that my choices aren't just for me. They're for the entire kingdom. If I marry someone who can't defend our borders, then what does that say about me? About my ability to lead?" Ethan's eyes softened, and he stepped even closer, gently taking her hand in his. "Sometimes, it's not about what others want from you. It's about finding someone who can help you become the person you're meant to be. You don't have to do this alone." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that. All her life, she had been surrounded by people telling her what she should do, what was expected of her. But in Ethan's words, she heard something else. Hope. Hope that she could be herself, that she could make her own decisions without fearing the consequences. "Do you really believe that?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled, a warm, reassuring smile. "I do. But I also know that no matter what happens, you're stronger than you think. You've already proven that. You've carried the weight of a kingdom, of an entire people, all on your own. That takes a lot of strength. But now, it's time to share that burden." Lyra felt a small spark of something deep inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of her duty, the constant pressure to meet everyone's expectations, had always made her feel like she was drowning. But in Ethan's presence, she felt lighter. He wasn't asking her to choose between duty and her heart. He was telling her that she didn't have to choose. She could have both. Before she could say anything else, the palace door swung open. A group of royal advisors entered the room, including her father. The moment Lyra saw him, she could feel her confidence slipping away. His stern face made her stomach twist with anxiety. "Lyra," King Aldar said in his usual commanding voice, "we need to discuss the situation with the Varkians. The peace talks are approaching, and we must be ready." Her heart raced as she glanced at Ethan. He stood beside her, calm as ever, but Lyra could see the concern in his eyes. This was it, the moment when her two worlds would collide. The choice between what her kingdom needed and what she wanted was no longer something she could avoid. "I understand, Father," Lyra replied, forcing herself to sound confident. "But I need to speak with Captain Matthews alone for a moment. It's important." King Aldar raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. "This is not the time for distractions, Lyra. The future of our kingdom is at stake." Lyra stood tall, meeting her father's gaze. "I know, Father, but I have to make my own decisions now. It's time for me to choose the path that feels right, not just the one that will keep everyone happy." There was a long silence before King Aldar nodded stiffly. "Very well. But remember, you are not just choosing for yourself. You're choosing for all of us." As the advisors left, Lyra turned back to Ethan. Her heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. But for the first time, she felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about making a perfect choice. It was about choosing the future she believed in. And Ethan, despite everything, was a part of that future. "We'll face whatever comes together, won't we?" she asked, her voice full of quiet determination. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "Together," he replied, his voice strong and steady. Lyra knew then that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wasn't alone. And for the first time, that thought gave her the courage to face whatever the future might bring. The tension between the kingdom's future and Lyra's personal desires had reached its breaking point. It was no longer just a matter of royal duty or love. The time for making a decision had come. But every choice she faced seemed to lead to a new set of consequences, each one more complicated than the last. She knew her father, King Aldar, would never approve of her feelings for Ethan. The weight of her responsibilities pressed heavily on her shoulders, and every day that passed, the pressure grew stronger. The upcoming peace talks with the Varkians were the final test. If she could not secure this alliance, her people would lose vital resources and fall into a dangerous position. Her father had made it clear that the fate of the kingdom rested on her ability to choose the right suitor, one who would solidify their strength against the Varkian threat. To him, that meant a warrior, someone with the might to protect them. But to Lyra, it seemed like a choice between what was expected of her and what she truly wanted. Ethan was not a warrior, but he had shown more strength of character than anyone she had ever met. Yet he wasn't the kind of man her kingdom would accept. On the morning of the peace talks, Lyra found herself standing in front of a grand mirror, adjusting her royal attire. The fabric shimmered under the light, the gold threads catching the sunlight. She barely recognized the person staring back at her. The crown she wore felt like a weight too heavy for her to carry. She wasn't just a princess. She was a symbol of power, a beacon of hope for her people. But all she wanted, in that moment, was to be free of the expectations, free of the responsibility. There was a soft knock on her door. It was Ethan. He had come to visit before the talks began, as he had promised. "Lyra, are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice calm and steady. He stepped inside the room, and Lyra couldn't help but smile when she saw him. Unlike the other guests at court, Ethan wasn't dressed in elaborate armor or royal attire. He was simply dressed in a well-worn uniform, his brown eyes full of concern as he looked at her. "I don't know if I'm ready for anything," she confessed, her voice heavy. "It feels like everything is about to change, and I'm not sure I can handle it." Ethan walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm and reassuring, and for a moment, Lyra closed her eyes and let herself feel the comfort of it. "You don't have to face it alone," he said quietly. "Whatever happens today, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She had never felt this way about anyone before. Ethan didn't just see her as a princess or a ruler. He saw her as a person, with hopes, fears, and dreams of her own. And that was more than anyone else had ever offered. The door to her chambers opened suddenly, and her father stepped inside, his expression as serious as ever. Lyra straightened, quickly wiping away any trace of emotion from her face. "Lyra, it's time," Cain Aldar said, his tone firm. "The Varkians will be arriving soon. We cannot afford to delay this any longer." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her father's words settle over her like a blanket of ice. This was it, the moment that would decide the future of the kingdom, and perhaps her own happiness, had arrived. She had always known she would have to make a difficult choice, but now that the moment was here, she wasn't sure what the right decision was anymore. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, his hand still resting gently on her shoulder. "You've got this, Lyra. Just remember, you don't have to do this for anyone but yourself. The kingdom will be fine as long as you stay true to who you are." Lyra turned to her father, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment when everything would change. "Father," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something before the peace talks begin." Cain Aldar raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but unwilling to show it. "What is it, Lyra?" Lyra's heart raced. She had never stood up to her father like this before. She had always done what he asked of her, always put the kingdom first. But today, for the first time, she wasn't sure she could do that anymore. Not without sacrificing something important to herself. "I can't choose a suitor based on power or alliances anymore," she said, her voice firming as she spoke. "I need to choose someone who respects me, someone who sees me as more than just a symbol." The silence in the room was deafening. Cain Aldar's face hardened, and Lyra could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Are you telling me you've already made your choice?" he asked, his voice cold. Lyra nodded, meeting her father's gaze. "Yes, I have. I choose Ethan." Cain Aldar's expression faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "A human, Lyra. A soldier. This is madness. You can't be serious. The people will never accept it." "I don't care anymore," Lyra replied, her voice stronger now. "I care about what's right for me, not what others think is right. Ethan is kind, brave, and loyal. He's shown me more strength than anyone I've ever known. That's the kind of partner I need." Her father stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and resigned. "You may have made your decision, Lyra, but you must understand the consequences. The kingdom will never be the same if you choose this path." Lyra felt a pang of sadness in her chest. She had always respected her father, but in that moment, she realized that she couldn't let his expectations dictate her life. She had to follow her heart, no matter the cost. "I understand, Father," she said softly, "but I'm ready to face whatever comes." With that, she turned to Ethan, who smiled at her warmly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He was there, ready to face the challenges alongside her. Lyra knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. And for the first time, Lyra felt that she had made the right choice. The peace talks with the Varkians were scheduled for the following day, but Lyra had no intention of going into them the same way she had approached everything before. She had made a choice. She had chosen Ethan, and with that decision, everything felt different, lighter, almost. It wasn't about power or alliances anymore. It was about her heart, about finding someone who understood her and respected her for who she truly was, not just as a princess. The royal palace felt colder that night. Her father's silence hung heavy in the air, and the echoes of his disappointed words still lingered in her mind. But Lyra didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel the overwhelming pressure that had plagued her for so long. She knew what she had to do. She had chosen Ethan not because he was the strongest or the most powerful, but because he saw her for who she was, a person, not a symbol. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lyra stood by her window, gazing out at the kingdom. The palace, with its shining towers and grand halls, was all she had ever known. But she had begun to realize that her future wasn't tied to the gold walls or the heavy crown she wore. It was tied to the choices she made, to the people she allowed into her life, and to the path she chose to walk. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his familiar warm smile bringing a sense of calm over her. He looked out of place in the royal palace, but somehow he seemed like he belonged with her more than anyone else ever had. "Lyra," Ethan said, stepping inside. "Are you all right? I know today wasn't easy." Lyra smiled, feeling the weight of the last few days lift slightly with his presence. "I'm better now," she said, her voice soft. "I've made my choice, Ethan. And no matter what happens next, I know it's the right one." Ethan walked toward her, stopping just a few steps away. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with understanding and care. "I'm with you, Lyra, no matter what." Lyra felt a surge of emotion rise within her. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she had been afraid of standing alone. But now, with Ethan by her side, everything felt possible. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." Ethan reached out and gently took her hand in his. "I've always believed in you, Lyra. You're stronger than you think." For a moment, the world outside the palace seemed distant. The weight of her crown, the expectations, the pressure, it all seemed far away. In Ethan's presence, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. But the next day, Lyra knew things would change. Her father would not approve of her decision. The kingdom would not understand. Still, she was determined to face whatever came next with the strength she had found in herself and in Ethan. When the morning of the peace talks arrived, Lyra stood tall as she entered the royal hall. The Varkians were already present, their alien features cold and impassive as they waited for the proceedings to begin. King Aldar sat at the head of the table, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room. Lyra knew his disapproval was still there, but she didn't let it affect her. As she took her seat beside her father, she felt a sense of resolve settle within her. She was not just a princess anymore. She was a person with her own desires and dreams, someone who was ready to lead her people in her own way. The Varkian ambassador, a tall alien with sharp features and glowing red eyes, spoke first. "Princess Lyra, we are here to discuss the terms of the peace treaty between our people. We expect to reach a fair agreement." Lyra nodded, her voice steady as she addressed the ambassador. "I understand. But before we proceed, I want to make one thing clear. My people will not be ruled by fear. We seek peace not through strength alone, but through trust and mutual respect. Our alliance will be built on understanding, not on who has the most power." The room fell silent as her words echoed in the air. Her father's gaze was sharp, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect. Lyra's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She had made her choice. She would not let her kingdom be ruled by anything other than her own vision of strength. The Varkian ambassador regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Your Highness, this is a bold stance," he said slowly, "but it may be the only way forward." Lyra held her breath, waiting for the Varkian's response. She could feel her father's tension beside her, but she refused to look at him. This moment was hers, and no matter what came next, she would face it head-on. Finally, the ambassador nodded. "We accept your terms, Princess. We will work together in peace, not as enemies, but as partners." The room seemed to exhale a collective breath as the tension lifted. The peace talks were far from over, But Lyra had just taken the first step towards securing a future where she wasn't just a princess, but a leader in her own right. As the talks continued, Lyra's thoughts briefly turned to Ethan. He wasn't a part of the council, but in her heart, he was her greatest ally. His belief in her had given her the courage to stand up, to speak her truth, and to make a choice that was entirely her own. When the talks finally came to an end, Lyra stood beside her father, her head held high. The agreement with the Varkians had been reached, but the real victory was her own. She had chosen her path, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was walking it freely. As she made her way out of the hall, she turned to find Ethan waiting for her. His smile was soft, but his eyes shone with pride. "You did it, Lyra," he said. And for the first time, Lyra truly believed it. She had made her choice, and with Ethan by her side, there was nothing she couldn't face. Together, they were ready for whatever the future held.